Friday as close as you can get on this earth to Plato's Utopia. And anyone who can bring us that, frankly, deserves our attention and a round of applause. Willie clearly needs no introduction. He's going to get one anyway. He's been entertaining us with wonderful travel books, latterly historical works for the best part of 25 years. Success came at a disgustingly early age, but was entirely merited and remains so. He has given us enormous amounts of reading pleasure and enormous amounts of the sheer pleasure of just learning about an astonishing range of subjects, from Near Eastern Christian mysticism through to Anglo-Indian horticulture in Hyderabad in the early 19th century, and pretty much everything in between. Always delivered with verve, with imagination, with colour, with superb prose style, and with deep research. And this is one of the things that distinguishes Willie as a writer, as a historian, is this craving to get to the roots of things, and above all, for me, the craving to tell other people's stories. I'm speaking as a journalist, and what we do is tell other people's stories. Willie does it through his books, and for this most recent work, wonderful work, which I had the privilege of reading and reviewing, on the first Western intervention in Afghanistan, 1839, the British invasion of Afghanistan, first Afghan war. Willie travelled to Afghanistan, dodged snipers' bullets, narrowly avoided Taliban ambush, just to get, the latter was actually just to get to the site, and I won't give away the end by saying this because I think most of you know it, get to the site of where the final survivors of the first army sent into Afghanistan in 1839 died under the knives and the musket balls of the Khilzai tribesmen of eastern Afghanistan. Willie got as close as any historian, I think, has got for probably the best part of 150 years. What history is to me, and I came into reporting partly out of my love of history, is the ability to give the answers to the present by delving deep into the past. And almost exactly 11 years ago, where are we, 2013? Yeah, 11 years ago, in late January, I was on the Shamali Plains north of Kabul, watching American troops roll in. The Green Machine, they called themselves, the American Army, the US Army, building a new base, a huge new base at the former Soviet airstrip at Bagram. Now, as Willie says in the book, Bagram is one of those locations that you find so many of in South Asia, but elsewhere too, where civilizations and armies have fought, have come together, have traded, have talked in this very place for an extraordinary length of time. And Willie in his book describes how he sat near Bagram with the then ambassador to Afghanistan, Sir Cooper Coles, discussing the present situation in Afghanistan, sitting in a village called Istalif, where the Afghan kings used to go for their summer holidays, and where you could see down from that village down onto this place where I watched the Americans arriving in 2002 by then. Now, the question I was asking myself then was, what is going to happen here? What are these people doing? What are these tanks here for? What are these jets here for? The sense of intrusion was very strong. What Willie has always done with his history, and this is really the third work in a trilogy looking at the 19th century, the first 6 decades of the 19th century, and the British experience in South Asia, and particularly the South Asian experience of the British. What Willie does with all these works is make them directly relevant to the contemporary world. So, many of you will know White Mughal is a wonderful detective story, a wonderful love story, dug out of the archives and told with great passion, but also which speaks directly in a world where people talk of a clash of civilizations. This was not a clash of civilizations. This was a wonderful, passionate love affair between two people of very different backgrounds in India in the early 19th century. This is a different book. This is a book, again, profoundly rooted in the present as well as in the past, bridging that gap, which speaks of war, and which speaks of war's misery, war's harshness, war's brutality and war's horror, with an unflinching and clear-eyed gaze. And that's what I liked about it to such a degree. There's none of this Orientalist claptrap about the Afghans being wonderful people, and there's none of the imperial bombast of other works about whether British Empire was a wonderful, beneficial exercise for the entire universe, or its inverse, its contrary. It's clear-eyed, and that's what I like most about it. Except for one thing, which for me really stood out, which were the voices. And why Willie went to Kabul and to Kandahar was to find, the reason was to find those archives, those books, those texts, which have not been used before, but which give back to the Afghans their voices. They talk about the conflicts as much as any of the more standard imperial British sources. And this is, for me, what history is about. It is about voices. These are the voices that reach back or call us across the centuries, call us, they chasten us, they warn us, they sadden us, but they uplift us, they enthuse us, they inspire us. I'm not sure whether Willie is going to inspire, infuse, or chasten or warn in the next hour. He's happily going to take a few questions at the end, about 10 minutes we hope, 15 minutes. Whether he will chasten, warn, uplift or inspire, I don't know. What I do know is that he will entertain us. So Willie, take us back to 19th century Afghanistan.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for that. I also thank you for incredibly generous and sweet review today's Observer, which I read at first thing this morning on my Google alert and made my weekend. Thank you. The first Afghan war, 1839 to 42, was the greatest catastrophe suffered by the British Empire in its history. An entire army of East India Company troops marched into Afghanistan in 1839. At least according to the legend, the reality is a little bit more muddy, but at least according to the legend, 2.5 years later, having been defeated in Kabul, the last remnants of that army limped out of the cantonments of Kabul on the 6th of January 1842, and 6 days later, one man out of 18,000 made it through to Jalalabad. The entire rest of the army were either captured, massacred, enslaved, or taken hostage. And there's that famous picture by Lady Butler of the last survivor, Dr. Bryden, limping into the gates of Jalalabad, called Remnants of an Army, which for a generation of Victorians summed up the full catastrophe of Britain's entanglement with Afghanistan. Now, the British have a particular talent in failing to learn the lessons of history. This is in many ways our fourth lost Anglo-Afghan war. And apparently there's a story that the folk memory of these humiliations survived at least until the 1950s, when Sir Harold Macmillan was handing over the keys of number 10 Downing Street to his successor, Sir Alec Douglas Hume. The younger man said, Sir Harold, is there any advice you can give me? And Sir Harold is supposed to have replied, well, dear boy, as long as you don't invade Afghanistan, you'll probably be fine. But no one seems to have told Tony Blair or George Bush this. And as you sit perusing the pages of the stories, you just wish that someone had spent 10 minutes with either of those blockheads, giving them a little bit of history. And millions of lives and dollars could have been saved. I began researching this book in about 2006. Rory Stewart, who was then based in Kabul, used to come and stay with me in Delhi. And we made elaborate plans over about 2004, 2005 to go and take our children on journeys through Afghanistan, and it all seemed perfectly safe. But by 2006, things were getting a bit more dangerous, and our plans for family holidays and picnics in Istalif were being slightly circumscribed. And you could see with each visit that he came, with fresh from the front line, so to speak, to tell me stories of what was going on in Afghanistan, that it was resembling more and more the trajectory of this first Anglo-Afghan war. An easy conquest, a slow alienation of the countryside, until the occupying army found itself surrounded in a few urban centers, increasingly beleaguered, leading to a final catastrophic exit from the country. And so I began researching this, and as Jason said, went to Afghanistan on a couple of occasions for extended trips, visited all the sites, and began to collect what turned out to be a hugely voluminous body of Afghan material about this war. Because while this is a war that was seared into the Victorian consciousness as a catastrophe, the inverse is also true, that it was seared into the Afghan consciousness as this supreme moment of national triumph. The Afghans remember this as, well, in British terms, their Trafalgar, their Waterloo, and their Battle of Britain rolled together. It's like what the freedom struggle is for you guys, this war is for them. And inevitably, this was a war that was much commemorated. One of the leading resistance figures, Wazir Akbar Khan, is the name now given to the diplomatic district in Kabul. Contemporary Afghan leaders continually draw on the stories of this war when they are discussing and thinking about their present. And I was told, I got 2 emails from Kabul a couple of weeks ago that Karzai was failing to read his briefing papers for his trip to Washington because he'd been up till 3 in the morning reading this book, because apparently he's haunted by the similarities between himself and Shah Shuja, who has a sticky end, as you will see at the end of this story. And apparently this is something that concerns him, because the closer you look, uniquely, the closer the parallels become. Normally, when you see parallels in history, as soon as you start looking in the details, everything begins to go a bit fuzzy, that, history doesn't repeat itself usually exactly. In this case, it almost does, because President Karzai is from the same tiny sub-tribe as the puppet the British put on the throne in 1839, Shah Shuja. The tribesmen who brought down Shah Shuja in 1842, the Ghilzai, now make up the foot soldiers of the Taliban. The same cities are seeing an exact replay, in many ways, to an almost eerie extent, of what happened 170 years ago. One anecdote. I went briefly to Kandahar, which was the only really tricky bit of research I did. And as Jason said, I got a sniper bullet in the back window of the car as we left the airport in Kandahar. And I went out to a shrine on the edge of Kandahar called Baba Wali, which is like the Nizamuddin or the Ajmer Sharif of Kandahar. And I went there because it was the favorite spot of the British governor of Kandahar in 1839, a guy called Sir Henry Rawlinson, who wrote a wonderful diary which survives in the Royal Geographical Society, which gives a wonderfully urbane and scholarly and rather objective view of the occupation. And I've been reading this for many months, and so I went to the place where he used to go in the evening to write this diary, which was this shrine, which looks out over the Arghandab Valley. And to get there, you pass the famous compound, famous now from 1,000 documentaries that you'll have seen on the telly, where Mullah Omar and bin Laden met on the edge of Kandahar, where Mullah Omar lived, where allegedly the first seeds of the whole 9/11 episode were planted. I sat reading Henry Rawlinson's diary in the shrine, looking down, and he described, in the passage I was reading, a party of British cavalry heading down the hill in front of him to the bridge over the Arghandab River, and he described the Durrani resistance massing in the plain below him, and he saw these two converging. As I sat there in 2010, reading the photocopy of this diary, I saw this convoy of American anti-blast Humvees. The Americans in Afghanistan travel in these sort of Star Trek vehicles, which are raised off the ground about 10 feet with convex bottoms, so that if IEDs go off, they'll have some chance of survival as long as it's not a direct hit. So these Star Wars style vehicles are heading down the hill exactly where the cavalry were. And as I watched, they crossed the bridge of the Arghandab River, and boom, this plume of smoke went up and an IED went off at exactly the point where Rawlinson described the Durranis and the British meeting in 1842. And throughout the research of this book, I've found these eerie parallels. There are important differences too. Karzai is a far more popular figure than Shah Shuja was. He's a democratically elected leader. For all the corruption in that government, which is prodigious, he is nonetheless a democratic figure, and there's certainly no parallel between between Mullah Omar and the people the British were fighting, notably Dost Muhammad Khan and his son Wazir Akbar Khan. So there are differences. It's not, as ever, history repeating itself exactly. But over and over again, one finds the same phrases cropping up. Here is John McNeill, the British ambassador in Persia, writing on the run-up to the war. We should declare that he who is not with us is against us. We must secure Afghanistan. This is 1839, that was written. Here is Sir Claude Wade, the British intelligence chief, the first spy master of the Great Game, discussing whether it would be a good idea to do nation building. There is nothing more dreaded or guarded against, there is nothing to be dreaded or guarded against, I think, more than the overweening confidence in which we are too often accustomed to regard the excellence of our own institutions, and the anxiety that some display to introduce them in new and untried soils. Such interference will always lead to acrimonious disputes, if not a violent reaction. So here he's saying, in exactly the same way as the neocons argued, it's okay to do regime change, but we don't do nation building. It isn't up to us to do gender reform, to introduce democracy, or try and reform the jirga system. So again, same sort of guys, these hawkish, armchair strategists, planning the invasion of a country they've never been to, and saying they can't really be bothered to do much beyond changing the regime for geopolitical reasons. Here is one of the survivors of the war, George Lawrence, writing to the Times just before Britain goes into the second Afghan war, 30 years later. And this guy, who's been a hostage, who's gone through incredible traumas, and finally, one of the few to survive the war, finds himself in old age writing to the Times, warning the politicians not to commit the same mistake again. A new generation has arisen, which, instead of profiting from the solemn lessons of the past, is willing and eager to embroil us again in the affairs of that unhappy and turbulent country. Although military disasters may be avoided, an advance now, however successful from a military point of view, would not fail to be as politically useless. The disaster of the retreat from Kabul should stand forever as a warning to the statesmen of the future not to repeat the policies that bore such bitter fruit in 1839 to 42. Now, they didn't listen then in the 1860s, and obviously no one has learnt the lessons again in 2001. So the story opens in a way that actually resembles more the beginning of the Iraq War than the current Afghan war. And I'd like you to imagine yourselves on the borderlands between Persia and Afghanistan in 1837. For the last 150 years, the East India Company has been fighting its way up the Ganges. A single Governor-General, Lord Wellesley, not a figure many remember today, conquered more of India than Napoleon conquered of Europe. At the same time, the Russians have been heading southwards from the Orenburg line, preparing to gobble up the emirates of Central Asia, the Bukhara, Samarkand, places now in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so on. And any strategist looking at a map, seeing the direction that the British are moving, north and west, and the Russians are moving south and east, can see that these two great European empires, the two victors from the Napoleonic Wars, are going to clash somewhere in the middle in Central Asia, in the Hindu Kush. And the hawks on both sides want their nation to be the first. They want to capture the high ground, because on a map it looks that if you get Afghanistan, you're there controlling the roundabout that goes from Persia to China, from Uzbekistan to India. If you capture that land, if you're looking at a map in London or Moscow or St. Petersburg, it seems that just moving into the Hindu Kush, it's going to be a cakewalk. You are the greatest military power of the day if you are the British. At this point, is the very moment when the British capture more of the world economy than they will ever do before or since. At the time of Vasco da Gama, the British control about 2% of the world economy, and India and China between them control about 70%. By this point, at the high watermark of British imperialism, the British control 50% of the world economy. They will never do so again. Soon, Germany and America will eat into that dominance, and the great long decline of Britain will begin. But this is the high watermark. This 1840 is the moment when Britain has more power, more military might, more troops on the ground than any other nation of the world. And they know they can just walk into Afghanistan. They think they can do it. Their armies have minced their way through innumerable other armies. They think it's not going to be a problem. So looking on the map, it looks very inviting. Get up into the Hindu Kush, control it, block Russia, capture those passes, and everything will be easy. And for about 20 years, alarmists and polemicists sitting in their clubs in London have been writing these tracts warning about the danger Russia poses to British India, and that if only the British were to get their act together, invade Afghanistan, we can block Russia and stop Russian Cossacks charging down the Khyber Pass and capturing India. So, there's trouble. The only thing that the Hawks lack is any firm evidence that the Russians have anything to do with Afghanistan. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. The Russians are still 1,000 miles from the Oxus, that there are many khanates and emirates between them and Afghanistan, and that in fact this is all, in reality, the pipe dreams of armchair strategists sitting many thousands of miles away. Until this one morning on the border, early morning on the borders between Persia and Afghanistan in the summer of 1837. Those of you who attended Tom Holland's wonderful talk yesterday on Thermopylae will remember the Behistun inscription, which he put up. Well, this young British Orientalist, Henry Rawlinson, the same guy I talked about earlier who was looking down the Arghandab, had spent the previous 2 years deciphering the cuneiform inscriptions at Behistun, but he's a British intelligence officer. And when he's posted to the Shah's camp in Meshed, he has to ride the length and breadth of Persia in 2 or 3 days on horseback in order to join the Shah's camp and negotiate with the Shah about his proposed invasion of Afghanistan. He rides and he rides through the hot desert in midsummer. And on the third night of his ride, he loses the track in the dark. And he gets lost. And he finds himself up an obscure defile, just as dawn is coming up over the Koh-i-Shah Jahan mountains. So imagine this first light over the mountains. You're in the desert, you don't know where you are, you've lost the road, you're in brigand territory between two countries that are about to go to war. And then you see, just as the light rises, you see a cloud of dust coming down the valley towards you. You're there with only one groom. You've no idea who is creating this dust storm, but it's clearly cavalry. And the closer they get, the more there are of them. You suddenly realize that you're alone and there's a hostile, possibly hostile force of horsemen riding down on you. So Rawlinson backs down out of the way and he finds a little place to hide himself and his groom, and he watches as these horsemen canter past. And to his amazement, they're not Persians, and they're not Afghans, nor are they a party of brigands. Instead, they are Imperial Russian Cossack cavalry. And they're charging towards Afghanistan. And Rawlinson's groom, who's with him, recognizes with the Russian party a groom from the Russian legation in Tehran. This is the first sighting, the first whiff of intelligence that the Russians have designs on Afghanistan. And over the following months, this one nugget of intelligence becomes what the yellow cake was for the invasion of Iraq. This one solid piece of intelligence, which in fact is an ambiguous piece of intelligence and can be interpreted in a number of ways and needs to be properly analyzed, is presented as solid evidence that the Russians are about to invade Afghanistan to take over British interests in that country. And the Hawks in London and Calcutta leap on this as the excuse that they have been waiting for in order to invade the country. In the same way that the neocons used 9/11 to dust out a plan they'd already had, designed with the Likud in Israel to encourage America to take on Saddam Hussein, who was then regarded as the main threat to Israel, so the hawks in this scenario use this one piece of evidence, the Russians going to Afghanistan, to persuade a naive new Governor General, Lord Auckland, who's just arrived in Calcutta, knows nothing about India and even less about Afghanistan, that he must invade Afghanistan quick and beat the Russians to it, or else he'll have Cossacks riding down the Khyber Pass and India will be lost. And Auckland buys this. And by the spring of 1839, the East India Company, supported by the British Army, has fielded at Firozpur in the Punjab the largest army that the company will ever put together, and the largest army that they have put together since the fall of Tipu Sultan in 1799. And off they set into the hills. There are 14,000 East India Company sepoys, 6,000 irregulars, 21,000 troops in all, accompanied by 38,000 Indian camp followers, off to war on 30,000 camels. One brigadier needs 50 camels just to carry his kit, while the general takes 260. There are 30 camels carrying pipes of Madeira wine, and 40 camels carrying cigars. One regiment comes with a pack of foxhounds so that they can go hunting on the way in. What they haven't remembered, or haven't got, is a map. These guys have no idea where they're going. Let's get some slides up. Can we have the slides again rather than this? There we go. It seems to be the fate. Here we are. So here we have some Pathans from the Fraser album. These were the kind of guys who were coming down to India to trade horses. I'm not sure where we're meant to point this thing. Is it pointing at you guys, or? Here is Alexander Burns, one of the early great gamers who the British send up in disguise to... I have to turn it on. Where do I turn it? Here is Shah Shuja, the Afghan king, the grandson of Ahmed Shah Durrani, who's been sitting in exile in Ludhiana. The British have been preparing him for just this moment, when they can whip him out of retirement and use him as their puppet ruler in order to replace him on the throne of Afghanistan and get rid of this other guy, Dost Muhammad Khan, in the middle here, who they think is very pro-Russian. In reality, Burns, the spy on the ground, tells them this is nonsense, that Dost Muhammad Khan is perfectly happy to make an alliance with the British. But the hawks ignore this because they want their war. They ignore the advice on the ground. And you have, in a very modern way, these interdepartmental jealousies. Alexander Burns, who's this dashing young spy, fluent in 5 languages, who's been knocking around Afghanistan and is ignored by his older colleagues who have never been to Afghanistan and who are jealous of this young man's celebrity. So his advice is ignored. And where are we? And all these troops are about to ride into action. Here is the army, all the foxhounds, the camels, all these forces setting off towards Afghanistan through the passes. These guys are sniping down at them, Baluchis. And this army the only map they have of the passes is a little sketch map made by a Napoleonic general who at the end of Waterloo was looking for employment after the exile of Napoleon. And he finds his way through the passes and finds a job with Ranjit Singh. And they buy this guy's diary and its sketch map for £50,000, which is a considerable sum of money in those days. And this is the basis of the maps which an entire army of 150,000 people is using to march towards Afghanistan. And they get completely lost. They have no idea where they are. Half of them, they're all wearing winter woolies for the cold of the kind of... and they pass through these deserts, boiling heat. Half of them die of thirst. It's a kind of epic disaster and a complete cock-up on a monumental scale. But such is the surprise when they finally get to Kandahar that this army emerges from the back end of the Bolan Pass when no one had been expecting it, that the rulers of Kandahar and Kabul and Ghazni all flee. And by the end of the month, Shah Shuja is back on the throne in the Bala Hissar. And initially, it all goes very well. The British have lost only a handful of men in the invasion of Afghanistan. Within a few months, the foxhounds are being taken out to hunt. There are amateur theatricals put on for the benefit of the Afghan nobility, and all sorts of plays by Sheraton have been being performed. They go ice skating and duck shooting. The Mem Sahibs are brought up from Simla. Lady Sale arrives with a grand piano and plants a kitchen garden with all the seeds she's brought from Roorkee. My sweet peas and geraniums were much admired, she writes. And in the kitchen garden, the potatoes particularly thrive. They try and teach the Afghans cricket, and Alexander Burns, who's now the deputy governor, he agreed to shut up and not rock the boat about the invasion, which he knew was entirely unnecessary, because he was rewarded with a knighthood, and he's now Sir Alexander Burns. Alexander Burns throws a New Year party in a kilt with an enormous sporran and dances Scottish reels with a bagpiper on the tables. And already there's talk that Afghanistan is such an easy country with such a delicious climate that that we should think of moving the summer capital of the Raj from Simla to Kabul. Today we think of Afghanistan as a very different country to India, but you should remember that for the Mughals, it was very much as much a part of their world as Agra or Lahore. And even today, researching this book, it always takes me aback that it's only an hour flight to Kabul. It's much quicker to get to Kabul from Delhi than it is to get to Bombay, Calcutta. It's very close. The political boundaries which have separated Delhi from Kabul are modern ones, but in geographical state, it's actually quite close to here. And so it all is going surprisingly well. Shah Shuja, hang on, here's Lady Sale, but we go back. Shah Shuja is on the throne of the Bala Hissar, restored to the throne of his ancestors. And the British are so thrilled by the ease with which they've conquered Afghanistan that they decide not to spend money on building a fortress to defend themselves. Instead, they just put their tents out in the plain. As you can see, surrounded on all sides by small hillocks and mountains with small mountains with little forts on top. And in time, they dig a ditch around the tents become buildings, and they put up a wooden stockade around themselves. But it's a completely indefensible site. They think they're still basically, outside Chennai or in the UP plains, and that they can just have a nice cantonment, and off they go riding their horses and doing all that stuff. Lady Sale playing on her piano. Emir Dost Muhammad surrenders, and the British are lulled into a completely false sense of calm and do what armies do. They take an interest in the Afghan women. I don't know whether any of you are planning to travel to Afghanistan, but I would strongly advise you not to take an interest, the males in the audience, in Afghan women, as it tends to come at a price. And there is a growing resentment among the males of Kabul that the British are turning Kabul into an enormous brothel. The Afghan women are using their burqas to go anonymously into the cantonment and come back a little bit richer. And this develops into, on all accounts, this is something, I'm not exaggerating this is something that appears in the Afghan accounts, in the British accounts, and in Shah Shuja's memoir, that there is clearly a huge amount of whoring and drinking going on. And in a conservative, patriarchal society, this is completely unacceptable. The final straw is when Alexander Burns seduces the mistress of Abdullah Khan Achakzai, who is one of the leading noblemen of court. And I will read you an account from Mirza Atta's Persian memoirs. It happened by God's will that a slave girl of Abdullah Khan Achakzai ran away to the house of Alexander Burns. It's not clear whether he was wearing his kilt at this point. When on inquiry, it was found that that was where she had gone, the Khan, beside himself with fury, sent his attendant to fetch the silly girl back. But the Englishman, swollen with pride, cursing and swearing, had the Khan's attendant severely beaten and thrown out of the house. The Khan then summoned the other Sardars and said, now we are justified in throwing off the English yoke. They stretched the hand of tyranny to dishonor private citizens great and small. Making love to a slave girl isn't worth the ritual bath that follows the act. But we have to put a stop right here and right now. Otherwise, and this is my favorite bit of the quotation, otherwise these English will ride the donkey of their desire into the field of stupidity. We're good at that. To the point of having us all arrested and deported into foreign imprisonment. I put my trust in God and raise the battle standard of the Prophet, and thus go to fight. If success rewards us, then it is as we wished, and we die in battle. And that is better than to live with degradation and dishonor. The other noblemen, his childhood friends, tightened their belts and girt their loins and prepared for jihad, holy war. So, the Afghans are good at this. And the British are completely unprepared. In their arrogance and conceit, they have made no preparations to defend themselves against any sort of uprising. There is only a stockade and a ditch, and their cantonment is surrounded on all sides by hills with small fortifications which they haven't secured. Even more idiotic, they've kept their storehouses of both their ammunition and their food for the winter in outlying forts. And the rebels, who know a thing or two about siege warfare, on the very first morning go out and capture both the food and the arms. By day 5, the British have lost their entire ammunition and all their food supplies. Sir Alexander Burnes is sitting at home and refuses to believe there's any danger. He is the first victim. Abdullah Khan at Chaksai surrounds his house with his men. Burnes has only 4 sepoys in his guard, and he is cut down as he tries to flee the house and killed. His boss, Sir William Macnaghten, famous for his blue tinted spectacles, goes out to negotiate when he loses all his ammunition and all his food, and is just immediately killed by the head negotiator, Wazir Akbar Khan. And his head is put on a spike, and his spectacles are hung up for abuse in the bazaar. The British hold out in the cantonment. Oh, this is the useless general. This is General Elphinstone, who is so riddled with gout that when the rebellion breaks out, he tries to get onto his horse, falls off, the horse falls on him, and that's him finished for the rest of the uprising. So it's a sorry tale. And the British hold out for only a month, as they have no food. They eat their foxhounds. That's all they've got. And when they've eaten the foxhounds, there's clearly no option but to surrender. They've lost their 2 leaders, they've lost their food, they've lost their ammunition, they've eaten the foxhounds. So a truce is negotiated with Wazir Akbar Khan, who promises them safe passage. Meanwhile, as this is happening, the snow is beginning to fall. It's moving from November to December, and by pure ill luck, it is the coldest winter in living Afghan memory. And there are snowdrifts 4 or 5 feet high, even on the plains, the Shamali plains, up in the Tezin and Kabul passes, it's even worse. But there is no option, and they surrender under safe passage. They have to surrender all their artillery, and they march out on the morning of the 6th of January into the snow with only their muskets to protect them. By this stage, there are 4,500 troops, almost all of whom, only 700 are British Army, white British Army Englishmen. The other 3,800 are sepoys from UP and Bihar, who have no idea about how to cope in the snow. Along with this lot, there are around 12,000 camp followers, grooms, saises, khitmagars, and that sort of thing. At 9 a.m., the troops moved off. This is George Lawrence writing. A crouching, drooping, dispirited army, so different from the smart, light-hearted body of men they had appeared only some time ago, with the men sinking a foot deep in snow in each step. My heart sunk within me under the conviction that we were a doomed force. So off they march. Now this guy is my great-great-uncle, who's called Colin Mackenzie. And he's written a wonderful diary which I use for this. And he remembers as they march out into the snow. He says, "I always remembered as one of the most heart-rending sights of that humiliating day, fixing my eyes by chance on a little Hindustani child, sitting perfectly naked in the snow, with no mother or father near her. She was a beautiful little girl, about 2 years old, just strong enough to sit upright, with her little legs doubled underneath her, her hair curling in waving locks around her soft little throat, and her great black eyes, dilated to twice their normal size, fixed on the armed men, the passing cavalry, and the strange sights that met her gaze. Many other children, as young and innocent, I saw slain on the road, and the women with their long dark hair wet with their own blood. The rear guard had to fight their whole way to Bagrami, and passed through a literally continuous line of poor wretches, men, women and children, dead or dying from the cold, who, unable to move, entreated their comrades to kill them and put an end to their misery. Having lost all their stores once, you'd have thought the British would have made an effort not to do it a second time. But as they all march out, they leave their stores till last. And the tents and the food, which is going to get them through to Jalalabad, 6 days' march away, are at the end of the column. And the Ghazis, who are out of control of the leadership, the jihadis, these wild holy warriors, just come down and they loot the baggage train. So as the British arrive at Bagrami on the first night of not there, and there's no tents. So they're cold and they're hungry. Now, the sepoys have got no idea how to survive in the snow. They've never been in snow before. They've never seen snow before. So they just bed down in the snow and go to bed. And they wake up the following morning, having spent the whole night exposed in snow, to find that their feet have turned black, like charred logs of wood. This is completely unnecessary. The Afghans who are with them know how to deal with this, and there are whole parties of Afghans fighting for the British, the Jezelchis, who show how to do it. And if anyone had been organizing it, there would have been no frostbite at all. The Afghans light a fire. They clear the snow around the fire in a circle. Then they bed down with their feet facing the fire and put all their cloaks and all their clothes next to each other, and they use their own bodily warmth in this flower pattern to keep each other warm. So they have a cold night, but they don't get frostbite, and they're in fighting form the following morning. But the following morning, not only have all the sepoys, or nearly all the sepoys, got severe frostbite, they are unable to use their hands to fire their muskets, which is a catastrophic thing, because the next day they walk into the mother of all ambushes. Just ahead of Bagrami is the Kurd Kabul Pass, which is so narrow that only 3 men can walk abreast through it. During the negotiations, the Ghilzai tribe, who feel they have no need to abide by any arrangements made by the Toffs in Kabul, the Duranis, have been building slit trenches out of the reach of the East India Company muskets, which can only fire 200 or 300 yards. They have these very clumsy, old-fashioned jezails, which are long-barreled guns of the sort you see in Mughal miniatures from the 17th or 18th centuries. They are very old technology, and they take forever to load, but they fire almost half a mile. And the Afghans just set themselves up out of the range of the British muskets, sniper rifles ready to have a go at this passage of this army through the narrows of the Kurd Kabul Pass. As the first, Lady Sale is in the lead with Skinner's horse, and she describes how she hears this noise so unmistakable in its character that it can never be forgotten by those whose ears have been startled by its unfamiliar metallic ringing sound. The whole of the hills are echoing to this metallic ringing, and this is the noise of the Afghans, who can't be seen, ramming their charges down their rifles. And once the British have marched down the pass, the ambush is sprung, and the entire, rather like the death road out of Kuwait for the Iraqi army during the first Gulf War, the entire column is stuck, stationary, panicked, unable to go forward, unable to go back, being shot down heavily from prepared positions. And it's a complete massacre. Lady Sale is lucky to be in the front. The confusion was fearful, she writes. We had not proceeded half a mile when we were heavily fired upon. The pony Mrs. Sturt Rose was wounded in the ear and neck, and I fortunately had only one ball in my arm. 3 others passed through my cloak near the shoulder without doing me any injury. The pass completely choked up, and for a considerable period we were stationary under heavy fire with no cover. That night the sepoys and camp followers, half frozen, tried to force their way into our tents and into our beds. Many poor wretches died around my tent that night. Many women and children were abducted. George Lawrence and my great-uncle, Colin Mackenzie, are given over as hostages, and as they ride back to Kabul, through the site of the massacre, they see unparalleled horror. We came across many bloody scenes, sepoys and camp followers being stripped and plundered on all sides, and such as refused to give up their money and valuables were instantly stabbed or cut down. On seeing us, the poor creatures cried out for help, many of them recognizing me and calling me by name, but what could we do? The Ghilzais had now tasted blood and showed their tigerish nature, becoming very savage and fierce in their demeanor towards us, demanding that we should be given up to them for sacrifice, brandishing their long blood-stained knives in our faces, saying, "Look upon the heaps of carcasses around us, as you will be among them soon. You came to Kabul for Afghan fruit, did you? How do you like it now?" As we proceeded, we met numbers of the enemy's horse and foot, returning to Kabul, laden with plunder of all kind. One miscreant had a little Indian girl seated on his horse beside him. So on they march, Wazir Akbar Khan making half-hearted efforts to stop the Ghilzais shooting down the last survivors. 18,000 men marched out on the 6th of January. By the 8th of January, after passing through the Khord Kabul Pass, only 8,000 are left. 10,000 have been killed. By the next night, they get caught in a blizzard at the very top of the Tezin Pass. 3,000 march out of that. The following night, 1,000 are left, and they are confronted with another narrow in the only pass leading down to Jalalabad, where the Ghilzais have erected a holly hedge with large spikes of thorns coming out of it. And the sepoys, in their panic, rush on it and are impaled on the thorns and shot down. Only 100 men make it beyond the holly hedge, and they find themselves exposed at dawn on this hill, the hill of Gandamak, where they shoot until their ammunition is exhausted, and then they fight on with their bayonets, and only one man is taken hostage from that, Thomas Souter, who has wrapped the colours of the 41st Regiment around his body and is presumed to be an English lord and is taken hostage. Everyone else is killed. 2 cavalry make it beyond that to the Nimla Gardens, which are one of the great Mughal gardens built by Shah Jahan for his passage up towards Kabul. There, 1 man is killed, 1 man makes it on to Jalalabad. Dr. Brydon has rolled up a literary magazine in his hat, Blackwood's magazine, which is the New Yorker or the Caravan of its day. And it's a good tip for anyone attending the literary festival. You should roll up Caravan in your hat just in case, because it's this that saves him from death. When they strike at him with their swords, the last Afghans pursuing him, it goes through Blackwood's magazine, which, unlike Caravan, has a hard cover, but it doesn't go into his skull, and he limps in to Jalalabad. The British are certain that there must be more survivors, so General Sale, Lady Sale's husband, who's in charge of Jalalabad, puts up lamps on the battlements of Jalalabad and has bugles sound from all the towers. A strong wind was blowing that night. This is Thomas Souter, which sent the sound of bugles echoing all over the town. The terrible wailing sound of those bugles I will never forget. It was a dirge for our slaughtered soldiers and heard throughout the night. It had an inexpressibly mournful and depressing effect. They send out search parties the following day, expecting to find last survivors somewhere, but all they find is huge piles of corpses. For the British, it is an incredibly humiliating, not just a defeat, but a wipeout. For the Afghans, it's an ultimate moment of national triumph and something approaching a miracle. They have defeated the strongest power in the world with very primitive equipment in 5 days. They have completely destroyed the entire British Army of Occupation in Kabul. Mirza Atta is thrilled. The proverb says that Afghanistan is the land of hawks, but India is the land of the carrion crow. It is said that the English and their Indian sepoys entered Afghanistan to free their prisoners and spend lakhs and lakhs to bribe the Afghans in allowing them safe passage. They had hoped to establish themselves in Afghanistan to block any Russian advance, but for all the treasure they expended and for all the lives they sacrificed, the only result was ruin and disgrace. If the English had been able to keep Afghanistan, would they ever have left this land where 44 different types of grape grow, and other fruit as well? Apples, pomegranates, pears, rhubarb, mulberries, sweet watermelons and muskmelons, apricots and peaches. And ice water. Ice water that cannot be found in all the plains of India. These Indians, these sepoys, they know neither how to dress or how to eat. God save me from the fire of their dal and their miserable chapatis. He wasn't a fan of desi khana, I think it's fair to say. So the British then send a second army into Afghanistan, the Army of Retribution. And this army has a very clear brief: to butcher, kill, and destroy, and in that way, bizarrely reclaim national honor. They send in, this time, an old East India Company veteran, General Pollock, who is meticulous and merciless. And as they advance, they burn every field, they level every village, they destroy every house, they rape women, they take a particular pleasure in cutting down and barking, removing the bark from every tree, as a lasting way of punishing the Afghans. They go into Kabul, they burn the town down, they dynamite the central bazaar, and then they return to India and declare a triumph. It is one of the most disgraceful and one of the most terrible pages in the history of the British in these parts. But it's also something that has direct relevance to the history of this country, because it is the sepoys, deserted by their officers in 1842, who rise up in 1857 at the First War of Independence, the Indian Mutiny, whatever you want to call it. And it is likewise the accounts that the Afghans write of these events, which are written in Afghanistan in 1842, 1843 in celebration of their victory, which are reprinted on the Persian presses of Hindustan in Agra, in Delhi, in Lucknow, and in Kanpur, which provide the inspiration for the resistance fighters of 1857 that the British can be defeated. And it is people like Subadar Bakh Khan, who have been left a hostage in Afghan hands, deserted by his British officers, who fights. I'm running out of time. I'll just finish by telling the story of how I thought I couldn't write this story without, as clearly the retreat from Kabul was going to be the emotional climax of this book, I felt I had to do the journey again in order to describe it. The trouble is that the second half, Gundamuk, backs on to Tora Bora, the place of bin Laden's last stand, and now deep in Taliban territory. Luckily, I was saved by the fact that the head of the Afghan equivalent of the ISI, the NDS, Amrullah Saleh, had read The Last Mughal, and when he heard that I had entered Afghanistan, I was hauled in to this place where all the torturing takes place in Kabul. I was very nervous, and I was given a lecture how I should write a fair history of this, but he was very keen to help me. And he set me up with this guy called Anwar Khan Jigdalik, who lived a few miles from Gundamuk, who was the former captain of the Afghan wrestling team, a mountain of a man, about 11 feet wide and 12 feet tall, who as a former Hezbi Islami Mujahideen commander. And he offered to get me to Gundamuk. So we drove off out of Kabul, past the site of the NATO cantonment, which is now built on the side of the exact site of the British barracks of 1839, and off we drove down the Khod Kabul Pass. And Jigdalik on the way was lecturing me. He said, it's exactly the same as last time. Both times the foreigners have come for their own interests, not for ours. They say we are your friends, we want to help, but they are lying. And it turned out, and it became clear as we went out and we talked to the villagers on the route to the retreat, that they all knew the story. Everyone knows in Afghanistan about Burns and McNaughton, though they are long forgotten in both India and Britain today. Whoever comes to Afghanistan, they will face the fate of Burns and McNaughton, agreed Muhammad Khan, our host in the village of Jagdalik. And we arrived at Jagdalik, which is where the holly hedge, where the last British and sepoys impaled themselves in the panic of the retreat. And Jagdalik told us that many anecdotes about how it was his ancestors who had built the blessed hedge, and how we never seemed to learn the lessons. But the villagers gave us the most enormous feast. Lambs were killed, kebabs were made, flaps of naan were produced. And it soon became clear by about 4 or 5 in the afternoon that we weren't going to get to Gundamuk because there's just so much food to eat. And I was trying to encourage Anwar Khan Jagdalik to get on and get me to Gundamuk, but he said, no, just one more kebab. But in the end, we had to just, at 5 o'clock, at sunset approached, had to go back by the main road to Jalalabad, and I never made it to Gundamuk, which was a blessing in disguise, because it turned out that that day, by pure bad fortune, the government had come to burn the poppy crop in Gundamuk. The villagers had called in the Taliban to defend them, and there had been the mother of all battles on the site of that last stand, which I showed you the slide of a few minutes ago. That merry morning at 9 o'clock. Had we turned up burping at 4 o'clock after our enormous dinner, I almost certainly would not be here to tell you this story now. But the following day, Anwar Khan Jagdalik took me to the Jirga outside Jalalabad, where the elders of Gundamuk, who'd taken about 100 police hostage, were coming to negotiate with the government for a resolution to this crisis. And we sat there watching this Jirga, looking down on the Jalalabad airfield, where these very sinister predator drones were taking off and landing. In films, like in the Bourne films, where you see predator drones, there's always one drone with one missile. In Jalalabad, it's like a kind of Delhi taxi rank. There's all these blessed drones taking off in long successions and buzzing the mountains and the valleys around about. And at the very end of the Jirga, I went up to the elders of Gundamuk with Anwar Khan, and we asked them about the situation. They said how it was a replay for them of 1839. And one of them told the story. He said, last month, some American officers called us to a hotel in Jalalabad for a meeting. One of them said, why do you hate us? And I, the elder, replied, because you blow down our doors, enter our houses, pull our women by the hair, and kick our children. We cannot accept this. We will fight back, and we will break your teeth, and when your teeth are broken, you will leave, just as the British left before you. It's just a matter of time. What did he say to that, I asked. He turned to his friend and said, if the old men are like this, what will the younger ones be like? In truth, all the Americans here know that their game is over. It's just their politicians who deny it. This is the last days of the Americans, said the elders of Gundamuk. Next, it will be China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willie, for plunging us into the reality of 19th century and indeed 21st century Afghanistan. There'll be no Q&A, a small sacrifice from our part for such a wonderfully